you so much for your hard work. Over to you.
Okay, great. Thank you, guys. Thank you, everyone. So there was lots of discussion on the initial publication to do data architecture, and I was quite impressed. I must admit, I've done quite a bit of data architecture in my life, and over the years, we've seen it disappear and not get as much attention as it used to. So it's really nice to see everybody here, and would love to help you guys as much as possible. So we call it how to plan data. That's sort of providing the planning, and that's part of the life cycle. And of course, it's the 5 wives and 2 husbands. And this time we will be doing a day in the life of a data architect. So I would like to see you guys at that session where we talk about, so it's a technique I learned about 2-3 weeks back after the last one, that I've now started to apply in terms of how would I take and describe the day in the life of a data architect. But that will be part of the data architecture session. So today we're going to be dealing with the practice managers, and then the week after is data citizens. And you'll notice that for data citizens, we'll start dealing with how does data architecture fit into the business? How does it map to the business strategy? How does it relate to the different areas within the business architecture? We then go on to, for professionals, the week after, we'll be talking about the day in the life that I've been sharing. And the last one is for executives. And I suppose this is the one that I find a lot. I don't know about you guys, but I really find that within EIM departments and data governance departments, there's always this tension between data architecture and data governance. Any of you others experience that scenario where you'll find that EA or enterprise architecture is really there to establish the solutions and the requirements of the business, and then EIM with data governance comes along and they say that data governance is responsible for the data strategy, the business requirements, and so we've got this discrepancy between the two. Anyone have challenges like that? Are you facing any of these problems?
Hey, Howard, Dineo.
Dineo,
Yeah,
yes.
You are spot on. Hey, they actually in a team where we have data governance and also data architecture, because we call ourselves the Business Intelligence Competency Center. It's a struggle on who's responsible for what. I mean, even currently, we have this reference data management that needs to be done, but it's a huge struggle between us. I ended up just taking it over, but data governance still feels that they should be looking at it. So,
right.
I'm hoping to get something out of this thing on how, those dynamics can be managed.
Fantastic. That's certainly, I mean, I've lived with that and I've battled with it. Some I succeeded, some I had a dismal failure, and we just had a battle all for the entire existence. So it was rather unpleasant. And hopefully we can deal with it. So we'd love to hear your stories and everything around that. Okay, so we're going to go into data architecture, and remember we are following the DMBoK. So what I am presenting here would really be about the way in which DMBoK defines the data architecture, and just to make you guys aware. For example, Veronica has been asked to review the new chapter in the DMBoK for data architecture. So we are about to receive, at some stage, pretty soon, we're about to receive an update so it's version 2.5 of the DMBoK, which is going to be just a data architecture release. So this is what we have at the moment, and I know there are a few of us on the call that are helping set the exams for data architecture, and that's going to be a scenario of you publish the exams and then we get a refresh, which we'll have to probably in some cases reset the exams. But I do find the data architecture chapter within the DMBoK pretty weak in terms of the detail, and I certainly know the experience that that we've had. Okay, so let's go through it all. And yes, Carl has pointed out the challenge between data architecture and information architecture. So, and I'll actually have a slide on that at the moment, and we'll go through that as well. Okay, so yes, Danae, we are quite interested to see the release, and when we get into the review, we'll share a little bit more about that. So this is a mind map of the different areas within the DMBoK for data architecture, and I really liked a comment that Martin Tenapel posted on LinkedIn, and he actually suggested that we add these words under the hand, which is coherence and balance. And I find that if we were to summarize data architecture, it's about understanding the entire data landscape and bringing them all together, understanding all the different aspects, for example, master data, that reference data that somebody's managed, and then making these decisions and understanding where the best place is for certain elements and certain controls and structures. So certainly agree with that in terms of coherence and balance. Okay, so as we go to the DMBoK, this is all 2 activities that data architects have to do. So they have quite an easy job, right? There's not much for them to do. Only 2 compared to big data or that have 6 or 7 or master data. But the focus that we'll be working on today is the data architecture, the practice manager and the data architecture. So they will start with evaluating the current data architecture specifications, what needs fixing, what do we need to do, and then preparing a roadmap and helping establish the practice of data architecture within the organization. And just to go back a bit, this is what we talk about as the data architecture design. Initially, when I saw that deliverable, I got quite confused as to what a data architecture design is in comparison to an enterprise data model or a data flow. This is about the practice and the integration with other areas. And then the implementation roadmap is how do we take this forward and how do we roll this out into the organization. Okay. All right, so if we focus just on the, and I like doing this, and that's part of, we talk about delivering CVs. So as a data architect, what experience do you have in building a design for a data architecture practice, doing data flows, data value chains, enterprise data models, and implementation roadmaps? And I have included in the data model, I've included that the enterprise data warehouse is also part of that enterprise data model. And we'll have subject area models and we'll have decision models that are in play. I also have started to make a lot more use of something called the data estate, which describes the data according to a subject area model across all the different areas. And then we have data stakeholders, data value chains, and data flows. Our data strategy is certainly an area that I certainly have a lot of success when I include a data architect in the data strategy development, and they would help me build the data value chain as part of the estate and prepare the data strategy. Okay, then there's also something else that I find in practice that they'll need to do is that of the data product definition, so the design of data products. All right, so these are the different deliverables that we're working on. And then if we go down, this is a definition of the data architecture section. We have basically identifying the data needs of the enterprise, regardless of structure. And this is where some of the challenges come in terms of data governance and data architecture. And I tend to focus on the second step more, is maintaining the blueprints. Okay, so getting our blueprints right and then ensuring that the organization operates according to those blueprints. And that would be part of the data flow that's going to link into your data privacy areas. These are the goals. Understanding the data storage, now that's becoming more and more complicated with data lakes across all of the different areas, data warehousing, and those different aspects that we deal with. We've also then got designing structures in terms of our data models, the enterprise data models, and we've got the strategic preparation, preparing the organization to quickly evolve in terms of products. So that's critical that the data architect is responsible for, in terms of allowing, once we have a change in the business architecture, how quickly can the data architecture change to support that adjustment in the business. Okay. All right, so then we go into just a definition of data architecture. I'm not sure if you guys have ever looked at the ISO definition for data architecture. Just get this out. And so this is the definition at an architectural level. It's the ISO 42010. It's a fundamental organization of a system embodied in its components, their relationships to each other and the environment, and the principles governing the design and evolution. So here was a simple UML diagram describing architecture. What are the different systems? And of course, that's something that we get involved with as well from a data architecture point of view. What systems are producing what data, what's happening on the CRUD, what are the different concerns and stakeholders, different architectural views, and what sort of artifacts or models are going to govern that. So the data architects are responsible for helping us define our development lifecycle, what data models are going to be produced, what is going to be created, what sort of views are going to be provided. And they should be setting the scene for us to build our data model. So from a data modeling point of view. Okay, so if we then go one step further, just to see the DMBoK definition, it is the needs of the enterprise, regardless of the structure, designing and maintaining master blueprints to meet those needs, and then using the master blueprints to guide data integration, the controlling of data assets, aligning data investments with the business strategy. So, and there's certainly a lot of crossover with the data governance in terms of aligning our data strategy with the business strategy. The levels within the organization, it's at all levels, right? So it's from the enterprise to the different domains, be they customer domain, whatever that may be, and then down to the project levels, or be the domain within the business units and organizational structures. The areas of focus is both the infrastructure, so they are there to focus on creating a level of architecture, of technology definitions. I like to, the way that I've seen the best result there is where the data architects define the reference architecture for data, and then when the business, if we have certainly at a federated level, if the business want to go out and purchase technology, they have to stick within the reference architecture. So there is a level of flexibility within that. It doesn't have to be dictated to every single level. Example of that could be your different data lakes and your different BI tools, your different forms of analytics. So how does a data architect define a blueprint that the different areas within the business can make use of that blueprint and then customize it or implement it to their needs?
I'd not to answer the question, but would that be something like, let's say a company does business in multiple countries, to divide things,
Yes.
to divide a system per country, for example, to decide if we're doing schemas for all the different countries, it's just going to be a field and a table. It's that type of decisions, right?
It's a lot more. So your enterprise data model will take it down to the field level and the attributes and the harmonization. But they also get involved in defining the infrastructure or the technology that would be implemented in that area. Now, depending on some of the operating model decisions that were made from a data governance point of view in terms of what level of federation do we have or lack of federation. So if it's all centrally controlled, then you'll find the data architects being more definitive about the technology, and that would apply to all of the different countries, ST. Whereas in some cases, if it's federated, and that may even be within the same country, but by different departments, there's the ability to choose the technology that a department wants to have, but then it must align with the reference architecture. So that reference architecture, be it both data and technology, is helped to define the blueprints.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you.
Okay, so certainly it's not restricted to data warehouse. It's also applicable to the architecture, and a good example of that would be master data. So if we were going to go very, very federated in our approach, in our structures, the appropriate architectural reference architecture or even patterns for master data would be somewhat of a hub and spoke scenario where they can link all of these together. Does that give you a good example of how that would apply?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. But good question. It is helpful to understand where their mandate stops and starts, and of course that should be done in conjunction with the data governance area and make sure that everyone's supporting the organization and how they want to operate. Okay, so as the DMBoK defines the different activities, establish the DA practice, evaluating existing data architecture artifacts, define a roadmap, manage the requirements within a project, so and then integrate with enterprise architecture. Now, you'll find a big difference. Anyone who was around during DMBoK 1, and I really like to make use of the DMBoK 1, where the data architect was responsible for defining architectures across all of the knowledge areas. And I don't know if you remember that, but you would have seen that they would be doing the BI architecture, they would be doing the reference and master data architecture, where that's changing slightly. And we now have that they would be responsible for getting the projects up and running within the different areas and then helping with the architectural design there, but then allowing, for example, a metadata specialist to define the metadata architecture. So there's been a change of thinking in that area. All right. Now, our focus for today is going to be in this area over here, and that's establishing a DA practice. And this is about the only area within, or the knowledge area within the DMBoK where they get down to defining a practice for a specific knowledge area. The other ones, for example, metadata, they don't really talk about how do we set it up. And I think partly to do with the fact that data architecture is quite different to that of, or operates within an enterprise architecture, operates quite differently. Okay. All right, so then this is when we talk about technology, the techniques that they are focusing on. Interestingly enough, the enterprise architects are dealing with a lot of the diagramming side of it, so having to pay attention to the diagramming clarity, and within that they will almost choose a language. For example, in data modeling, are we going to use UML? Are we going to use the Chen notation or Baker, whichever one that is? It's up to the architects to define the notation that will be used and the clarity, and giving you guidelines on how to do appropriate data models. So they are involved at that level. And then lifestyle projections in terms of the different ways of describing the future, the future requirements, the sunsetting. I don't know if any of you guys have seen the sunset diagrams where they'll sunset both applications and in some cases data. And so how do we retire it? How do we look at the active and how do we look at the future? These are lifestyle projections. Anyone involved with that? Anyone got something to share on sunsetting and have the experience with that? Paul, have you been involved in sunset design?
We have done something. It wasn't under the auspices of data architecture, but it was within the context of sort of a broader context. We needed to look at all these aspects of the DMBoK and pick out which ones do we put in front of the other. And that sunsetting helped quite a bit to just sort of put it on a page, although it's still not easy.
Yeah. So that sunset design will also get involved in terms of, for example, if you are currently using Microsoft's MDS, how would you sunset that for moving on to into Informatica or things like that? When would you decide that an application or a technology is actually causing problems? And it's about identifying that this application, maybe that's managing a certain area of the data quality, they would be responsible for reviewing the impact of that application on the data, and when would they consider to sunset and a technology. Okay, and I think there are quite a few questions in terms of is this lifestyle a bug within the DMBoK? And yes, the answer is right. That's certainly not a lifestyle. There's not much that we're doing, but I do believe we were waiting for the corrections to come. They haven't been published, but I believe it's lifetime projections with the retirement and the sunsetting. Okay. Yeah, that technology radar or the Gartner one, which has a sunset diagram. It's actually quite a nice visualization. Okay, so then we get into the governance side of it. So how do we govern data architecture? And here's another problem in terms of managing the lifestyle. It's managing the lifetime, designs, tools, oversight, and the different metrics. Okay, then I've brought this one in as well is implementation roadmap. So are we ready for certain technology? Are we ready for certain capabilities? Architects will get involved with that. And of course, this is going to be in conjunction with the data governance. And you can see the overlap that we're getting involved with here is quite a lot. Implementation, you'll find that the architects would be responsible for bringing in new technology and then having to deal with the culture change. So, for example, bringing in a data vault or an anchor modeling, and how would we manage the change on that? Yes, so the Microsoft MDM, it's called MDS, Microsoft Master Data Services, that came from a product called Bulldog that they bought out, and they didn't really take it as far as it needs to go. And there were certainly packages within that and within that approach. We're actually dealing with a company that's still got MDS. Okay, so then when we get into of course, if anyone does architecture without the Zachman, probably people will start asking questions. And when we look at the data practice manager, this is the area that they need to focus on. So from a business management point of view, and what are the high-level business concepts? Okay. Now, anyone give me an example of an inventory definition with respect to a data architect? What sort of deliverable comes in there in that area over there? Anyone got an answer for that?
I could maybe take a guess, but that would be more on the the process side, right? And maybe the value chain first.
Okay, so inventory definition. So in terms of the what, that would almost be, for example, your subject area model from a term of business concept, and it could also be a scenario of a data catalog. So a list of all of your assets. So that's an inventory at an inventory level. So what data assets do we have, and what business concepts do we have as well? So those are the two types of an example at an inventory definition level. Does that make sense, Paul?
Yeah, I think so. I'm trying to think practically. If I think about some ARIS models or case-wise or this sort of thing, typically the guys who do their work in there, those would not be data architects actually. So thinking out loud,
what I'm actually referring to, so within the data architecture, if I was to talk at what of data architecture would be an inventory, what would be a definition for data architecture? What would a definition at a management level be of the elements for data architecture?
Okay, yeah, okay, that makes sense.
Sorry, and then, for example, a business process would be some sort of enterprise, in terms of the enterprise data model. How would that process, how would they help implement or use the enterprise data model as a starting point, as a blueprint for an application data model? So they would then have the processes or the set of processes within the data modeling lifecycle. How would they hand over from the enterprise data model to the data modeler to build a model for an application? That should be an example of a process definition.
Okay, so on this level, we're not talking about the actual level 1 business processes in ARIS or whatnot. We are talking about really more of a not the life cycle of the data, but the life cycle of or the usage, the way that the different models will be used, right? The actual data models will be used. So the data.
Okay, so yeah, let me set the context. So we can take the Zachman framework and apply it to any aspect. And what I've done now is taken the Zachman framework and apply it to the data architecture practice definition. So for a person who's going to head up data architecture, what would, at a business management level within the Zachman framework, what would go into these different cells? What are the examples of the different cells that a data architecture practice manager would define? So
yeah.
Okay, so it's really helpful as when you set up a practice, you've got to remember we said review the existing data architecture artifacts, right?
Yes.
And these are the types of things that would come in here: the what, the how, the who. So who's responsible for what? When does it happen as part of the SDLC? Why do we do it? The mandates that we have, and then where is it happening within the organization? So that's what a practice manager would need to do when setting up or defining data architecture within a business.
Right.
Yeah, so what Carl's raised here is enterprise architecture used to describe the business of data architecture practice, and that's typically where it's done. If you have an enterprise architecture, I find a lot of the times in quite a few businesses they don't actually have EA, and what we then need to do is you'll find EIM or data governance will say we've got a problem, we don't have enough architecture. They would probably start with a data architecture area, and then at some stage when we get the business architecture or the complete set of business architecture, then it would sort of it would move to that area. But EA would typically take responsibility for defining this, and it would sit within the enterprise architecture domain. But EA would be responsible also for defining this entire map, and bringing all the inventory flows and the process definitions together. All right, sorry. So,
yeah, but I mean,
yeah.
it's very important to get that context right. How in looking at the Zachman framework, it always takes me a bit of time to get the right.
Yes.
Sort of where am I?
Yes.
It's almost like like Hoberman had the camera settings.
Camera settings.
Almost need, like what is my departure point when I look at this diagram, and how do I think about it?
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, it is that setting of that context. Carl, I see you've got a comment there saying, no, we are doing our own EA just for our practice.
Yes, Howard, so the way I see it is not describing sort of the commercial processes of the business. We're describing our mini world of
Yes.
What are the processes that we're going to follow as a data architecture practice.
100%.
Why are we doing it? What are the artifacts we're going to produce, etc.
Yes. So you can define, and Danea, that's one of the lessons that I learned when I was battling with that one customer where we fought with EA. The next one that we went in, they had a really good mandate definition. So what were the mandates of data governance, EIM? What are the mandates of EA, data architecture, and who did what? And thrashing that out and getting roles and responsibilities and getting all of these things well defined by the data architecture practice definition within EA, that helped us a lot to resolve some of those issues. And if you don't have this well defined, that's when you start headbanging between the different departments. Danea, does that make sense? Does it start to give you an idea of how you can resolve some of these issues? Okay. All right. So yes, that it's all about defining the data architecture practice. That's what we're working on. Yeah, I think, Mark, you're right. So even within a department, it's still helpful to go through this process so you can resolve these different challenges. Once you've got the mandates defined, at least you've got something to argue about, or you've got a race seat defined, and you can start saying, this is what we agreed. Whether that's right or wrong, it's a different story. We can debate it at a different level. Now, one of the things that I wanted to explain was almost the difference between a data architect or an information architect and a data modeler, is that you'll find that your data modeler is going deeper and your architect is going wider. Okay, so as you can see the progression, and you'll find a data modeler sitting somewhere over here, this level just to the side of a developer. The enterprise architecture will look at building enterprise data models across the entire organization, whereas the modeler will be looking at it specifically for an application. And that's how we bring about the definition, the difference between the two. Now, what you will find is that if we talk about integrating or implementing the data architecture strategy within projects, then you need project architects that will be involved in every single project, and they're responsible for handling that interaction between a department or an application and the data architecture or enterprise architecture. So you can see how we get solution architects. I don't know if you guys have heard of that. You have a solution architect, and then you have a technical architect, which is more related to the technology and the application. And then you have project architects that will be doing some of the data architecture work within a project and can be backfilling some of the designs into the enterprise data model where there are changes. That's typically the role of a project architect. Okay, now you'll notice this definition uses a domain as information security, application, communications, whereas a lot of times when we talk about a domain, we'll be talking about a subject area, being a customer, an order, invoice, whichever one that may be. But I just wanted to highlight here the difference between that of an architect versus a modeler or a developer, and just to see that. Okay, so how do we set up these? Now what we wanted to refer to here is setting up of a data architecture practice. These are the areas that that practice manager needs to focus on. So the strategy, selecting frameworks, the approaches, the roadmap, getting the acceptance and culture going for data architecture, and that's one of the difficult areas. And I've seen a lot of success stories, but I've seen lots of failures where data architecture has a similar feeling to that of data governance, that they're just there to pull the handbrake, they're just there to stop people from doing the work, and they have different levels of discussion that tend to get involved with paralysis of analysis. But that's hopefully not where we're going, and we're wanting to ensure that we provide value. And it's really hard because if you have a data architecture team, and you now have to spread yourself across every single project within the organization, it's not easy. So how do we facilitate this, and how do we work with the people not to stop the development and not to put handbrakes and pull handbrakes at the wrong time, especially when they're just about to go live? That's the wrong time to have an argument about it doesn't align with the enterprise data model. You should be picking that up a lot earlier. So it's this, how do we integrate, how do we get the acceptance from the organization? Otherwise, the guys just keep running and they just keep on ignoring, and that's probably part of the hardest challenge that architects face, is trying to set that enterprise level, but then no one's adhering to it, or it's too hard, or okay, the organization, how do we get the accountabilities and responsibilities, and then working methods. So enterprise architecture is responsible for setting the project data requirements. We should be very clear on when these projects get going, what are the deliverables that project should deliver on. And they should be reviewing project data designs. They should be building the data model scorecard, be on that team, understanding the data lineage. Okay, so one of the core aspects of a data architect should be the data flows and the data value chain, and they have to get that right, and they do it through reviews and understanding where the data is moving. Okay, so yeah, I mean, it's extremely difficult. I've worked in enterprise architecture areas where everybody just bringing in whatever application, and it sort of refers to what Mark's bringing about, is how do we do this with 3,000 apps? That's typically when the organization starts to create an enterprise architecture to get some level of control. And then they have to be quite dogmatic, and they start sunsetting things, and that's when the relationship starts to deteriorate. They've got to get some level of balance in there, and it's not easy. So they suffer from the same problems that data governance suffers from, in terms of trying to bring in control and not overstepping the mark, and then just having complete dominance within that area. Okay, so this is
Max here.
Yes,
Just
Max.
a question on previous. In business architecture, we are talking about business capabilities.
Yes.
And how do you see that relate to the data architecture? I mean,
Yeah.
are they tightly coupled, or
Max, they've got to be tightly coupled. We talk about when I build a data strategy, I sort of make recommendations that if you don't have a business architecture with a good business strategy and a good capability map, you should probably pause the data strategy until you get something in place. And then it's part of that capability cube where you have, if you have your business capability map and then you build the cubes, one side of it should be data, and it should show how it maps to the capability model.
Mm-hmm.
So I certainly like to build my subject area model from the business capability map.
Mm-hmm. Okay, good. So that also means that the producer of some part of the data architecture is always can be always mapped to one business capability.
Yes, yes, definitely. And so that so that's the way of keeping the organization flexible, so that if the business changes, I always recommend using the capability and not the business process model, because the capability changes less and it's more related to the value proposition and the business value chain. We have a mapping to that area, so that if I can link my data architecture and my data models to the business capability model and the business value chain, I can then build, it's a lot easier for me to build the data value chain.
Yeah, okay, clear.
Okay, so yes, 100%. I'm glad you brought that up, and we'll actually take that through. You remember when I introduced the data citizen, it's how do we map the data to the business, and how do we ensure that we've got that relationship. And I use the business capability map. I really like that, because I like to do almost at a level 1 and 2 of the capability map. If you do your nouns and your verb analysis there, it's actually quite a relatively simple way of getting a data estate and a data subject area from the capability map. If you don't have one, if you don't have an industry data model. Okay, so then if we go to this, and this is sort of where what I've just said disagrees with this image, and I just wanted to share that, is you see how they're relating the architecture to the process and not to the capability. I disagree with that. I prefer to map mine up to the capability level, but I really want to get into that. What I wanted to show is that this relationship between the data architecture and the business architecture is important, that we link to the information architecture. I know Carl was mentioning that. And you will find that within TOGAF, sorry, Dave, do you want to put that person on mute? Okay, so this is really important, and that's something else that you want to establish with your architects pretty quickly, is the mapping between that information architecture and the data architecture. I don't believe that this is completely right, where it's just information management. I believe there's a data aspect to that as well. But this is where I wanted to share with you, is that link that's important there, and that would relate to something in the DMBoK. But there's a mapping there as well. Okay, Max, is that in line with your understanding and thinking?
Yes, it is. It is,
okay.
Very much. Thank you.
Okay, so then when we get to just what are the focus areas for the practice, the management, it's making where are the decisions being made at a strategic level, tactical and operational. Where are the practice roles and responsibilities at an organization level, the data architecture level, and the enterprise architecture? What are the costs that we need to focus on? How do we provide value? That's the management must ensure that we've got business alignment and cost benefit analysis, and then the change. So how do we affect the day in the life of people? What is our engagement plan? What is communications and stakeholder analysis? So those are the areas that a practice manager needs to focus on and needs to make sure that they've got. So here is my Zachman framework for the architecture practice manager. This is what they need to be taking care of. They need to be looking at the measurement and change management, and then costs. Okay, so this is sort of all the questions that a practice manager should be taking care of. So these are the different areas on establishing a data architecture practice. What are the decisions that are being made within that data architecture practice? And then what roles? What are the roles within your organization? What are the levels of a data architect? So what do we mean by a solution architect, a technical architect, an enterprise architect, and then also a domain architect? Okay. All right, so one of the things that I always like to do is is if you're going to set up a practice and you're going to measure it, you need a scorecard. I don't know how many of you guys have spent time building scorecards across all of your practices. If you've been around me for long enough, you'll know that that's one of the first things that I try to set up, and then try to allocate a percentage dependent on your current maturity level. So across these different areas where we have the strategy, where we have the culture and change, these are the different percentages that I would put initially on a data architecture practice. Okay. Anybody done something like that for a data architecture practice? Okay. All right. So then how do we, the sphere of influence, I think this is an important thing that the data manager, the practice person needs to be aware of, and needs to be able to, when they impact and when they design their stakeholder and when they design the communication and the impact within an organization, these are the things that we need to agree and get working so we don't have conflict. So Danae, these are the types of things that you want to have in place. They don't always allow you to have that in place, but these are the things that you want to get right. And the data architect is there to define the project data requirements. So they would translate that from a business point of view, business requirements, into this project. What are the data requirements for this project? So if you remember some of the stuff I do in data governance, where we do a SWOT analysis, that's all about what is the friction that the business is experiencing with data as part of the data strategy. We get that right, we understand our challenges, and then we have to implement, we have to use projects to fix these issues. So an architect would be helpful in defining what the requirements are and agreeing that this project needs to implement, for example, a master data system. That's some of the requirements that they may come in there. What are the data designs? And that would be models and flows. What is the data lineage impact? Are you going to get in the way of the data? How do we share the data that this project establishes? And then how does the data architect ensure that we've got the right architecture standards come along? And then it's the guidance of the data technology. So ST, here's where we get involved in the blueprint, that the reference architecture that we use to help our projects go along. Okay, so how do we evaluate the as-is definition of our practice? So we have to look at existing system documentation. What are the time horizons? Remember we spoke of the lifetime projections. What are the data models? What are the documentation for the other knowledge areas, for example, metadata, knowledge management, reference and master data? Do a review on the quality, helpful for the data architect to know how to build quality evaluations, because the data quality is going to be a good indication of what is the quality of the data models and what is the quality of the compliance. And a lot of the times when I come to the end and do my root cause analysis of data quality, it goes back to the data model. And then we have to do the update if necessary, whichever we find appropriate. Okay, so building the architect roadmap is what I have allocated to the data architect professional, but the data manager needs to ensure that when we put this purpose down, why are we doing it? Okay, so we want this active management within the data area. We want to be able to explain to the organization where we're battling in our data value chain. We want to be able to bring in some forward-looking decisions, for example, advanced analytics. This must be a big area where they're bringing it in. How do we then introduce analytics that can have impacts on business processes? How do we bring that about, and how do we, in some cases, make better digital decisioning processes rather than building business processes where we can make use of data? And then, of course, bring in a pragmatic plan. And here I have stated the alignment with the business needs of the SWOT. Okay, so what you're trying to achieve is a 3 to 5 year development path. describe the target architecture. What are we trying to get to that everyone will buy into? And then we have to resolve data dependencies. Okay, now that's quite a tricky approach. So here we get to the capability map. Max, I'm glad you brought it up because this is one of the key areas that we have. Identifying the capability map and then understanding the interdependencies between these capabilities. So a lot of the times, the data architect is there to ensure that we're not holding up the business capabilities and we're dealing with different dependencies. And here you can see I've introduced something called the data value chain. And I was actually quite astounded to realize that there are not many people that are building data value chains. And please don't get me wrong, I'm not talking about a value chain that most of your vendors get along to say they acquire the data or they plan for the data, they acquire the data, they transform the data, they analyze the data. That to me is not a data value chain. It's related to the business use of data and how do we achieve that. So we haven't seen a lot of data value chains being produced, ones that are really helpful to go in and have a look at, and then how do they remove the interdependencies of this data. All right, so there we have the resolving of data dependency. So notice here that I've got this comment in here, follow the data originator order. Now, if you guys have read the DMBoK, that is almost one of those CRUD matrices that people have. But then we build the data flow and we build it by business value chain. I like to build my data flows and my data value by business value chains. Okay? And then we get into resolving dependencies. So where do we have dependencies? Anyone done this? Anyone produced a data dependency map at an enterprise level that follows the business value chain? Okay.
Mark says, yep.
Oh, I didn't see your hand go up. Mark, you done one? Have you built a data value chain? Any experiences on your side?
Yeah, I wanted to clarify just the data flow. This talks to that, talks to that. I never got the chance to tie it to business value, but I'm working on a project like that now.
Right. Okay, so a lot of the times what you'll see is the data flow is almost at an application level. So where they get the source data, where do they get data coming in? And then from that application, how does it get into a warehouse? That's most of your data flows, data lineage, which is great, but it doesn't tie that across different business capabilities and probably some different departments with an aspect of data sharing.
Mark, so for that kind of thing, right? What do you do it in? What do you use?
What Excel and Visio, of course.
Okay.
I'm being a little bit.
I think it's probably for a lot of people.
Yeah, no, it's I'm really looking forward to getting my hands on some automation tools, some things like Elation or Calibra that have crawlers. But I mean that's a project I did in the past, not one that I have to do today. Today I got another challenge.
Yeah. Okay, so
levels. Oh, sorry.
Sorry, Paul, did you want to say something?
I just wanted to say, so I mean, for this grain or level of work, crawlers and things like that will be too low, right? So you kind of need a high level, like almost a Visio level, or maybe, I mean, I would probably go for Archimate, but especially if you need to start to link those things to capabilities and so on, you still need to stay above real things like real applications and data. Otherwise, it's going to be too messy. Or what do you think?
Yeah. So we understand. There's another question there in terms of the question about data lineage gives us data flows. And yes, if you map out the data lineage across of all data in the organization, it does give you data flows. But what you're missing within those data flows is then the value that the data introduces. And I'll show you in a diagram now, Paul, to answer your question. At what level does this operate at? And data flows, they got almost at a level 0 where they're talking about the different places where the data comes to rest. But to give you an example of a diagram, it's this is the type of thing that I'm referring to. So
yes, so this is not crawler level stuff. This is conceptual high level.
Yeah, so you've got your data dependencies between business capabilities that are supporting a business value chain. Okay, Paul, does that answer your question?
Yeah, that makes sense.
But Max, on this level, you're not going down into any detail of what kind of data.
There you see there's I've got product data, all right, and customer data and sales order data, but it's at a business concept level, Matt.
Yep, got it.
Okay. Now, the nice thing about this is that when you look at this diagram in terms of lowest level of dependency, so product manager, no one's responsible. The product management, that aspect is not dependent on anybody else in this diagram. Okay, and this may be incorrect or may be different, but product data has no dependency on any other data, which makes sense in a similar type of thing where I design my product and my information about my product, and at that point in time, I'm not really worried about customers and aspects like that. Please remember, this is just a diagram. It may not be the same as the diagram in your business, but this is just explaining that at this highest level, product data is not dependent on any other data. Okay, but if I look at a bill of materials, it's dependent on the product data. And if I look at the assembly, it's dependent on the bill of materials and the product data. And the production order management is dependent on all of these up at higher levels. So you can start working out your dependencies, and the big benefit you get out of this is you can say, right, already at this level, I've got good indicators of where my master data is sitting. And the next one that I get out of this is I've got good indicators of where BI or data warehouses need to come in to support my business capabilities.
Yeah, this is a nice overlay.
This is really nice, and the next diagram that I don't have here is where you start to get into the CRUD matrix and you start to look at ownership and you start to look at how the data flows. So where am I creating assembly data, and where am I creating bill of materials data? Which area and which domain am I creating those different areas? But we'll get into that next week, and we'll describe those different levels of interaction. All right, so yes, here you see the next week's talk about how do we integrate with the data citizens and the business architecture framework, and we'll go into a little bit more detail there. Are there any questions? I know I've gone slightly over time.
Howard, how would you kind of work around with the conflict between like data governance and data architecture, and almost when it's not like what is mine, it's kind of nobody wants it to belong to them.
No, so the way I like to do it is the data governance is there to enable the business and to enable decision making of the business. So when they put a data strategy together, the first thing they look at is where's the friction that business has with data, and then once they understood it and they've defined all of these challenges and put some level of roadmap down in terms of how to fix it, it then goes to the next level of detail that the architects take, and they build the data models for that data, those data requirements, and they also build the data flow and the data lineage. All right. But they would get it right at a high across the organization. So if we're sharing across capabilities, that's where the data architect gets it right. And then they'll use projects within different departments or where the people have ownership of data, or they're going to be creating the data, and they will ensure that when somebody designs a data model for that application, it's in line with the enterprise definition, and they sort of look at getting the harmonization right. And they look at making sure that the data modeler is not building a data model that's completely contradictory to the enterprise data model. So they'll be able to do the integration and then to be able to share data that is helpful to the next level within the business value chain.
Okay, so it's different levels. The one
Different
feeds from
levels.
the other ones.
Completely different levels, but they remember they provide the guidelines and the blueprints. Okay, but then the data model takes it down to that next level, and so they would then be converting it to a specific technology. So, for example, if they're using Data Vault, and then how would that physical design, the modeler would get it in and get that working at that level.
And then, for example, so let's say Data Vault's the thing. If they're like, okay, Data Vault, but use it if it works for you, or don't use it. Kind of like a very open approach.
Yeah, that doesn't help.
Or difficult.
You are right. So, and what I always like to say to the architects is saying, if you can go in there and show the people that you are providing them value. So, for example, if you go to a data modeler and you give them the high-level diagrams for their project, I mean, that's going to be fantastic. It's a case of, oh, shucks, so you've already got a layout for me, and now I need to just fill in the details. And so they have a starting model. One of the things that data modelers battle with is that blank page. Where do I go? How do I completely understand this domain? And do I understand where the data is going to be required by other people? And that's where the data architect helps the data modeler. And if the data modeler perceives that help and recognizes that help, then the relationship's okay. When that's not the case, then you start having the tension that you're talking about.
Yeah, so the data architect almost giving a physical artifact down,
Yes.
and not just directing. I want to say, like, not directing, saying ask this, do this. It's a more physical item to say, okay, start here, flesh this out. Yeah, that's okay.
And not only that, that's where we talk about project architects, where they can actually take the artifacts of that data model and bring it back to the enterprise data model if you don't have one.
Yeah.
So that's what we refer to as that backfilling. So when lots of people run architecture down and also run enterprise data models down, but the data architects have to take responsibility for helping a project deliver and then complete the data model when it's done or when they finished their involvement on that scenario. So and it's very similar to, they call it a project data steward, where the project data steward would be responsible for example, for building a business glossary at that level, and then taking it back at a project level and taking it back to the business level. Similar type of idea that you can use and get benefit out of that. Okay, there was another question on a prior slide. What features allow you to define that some business domains are in the master data area and others are in the BI area? Okay, so what I've found is that those with that almost a lower level of dependency, those are the ones that start to give you good identifications of master data. Okay, so you can see here where I've identified this is customer. So customer on its own is not really dependent on how we sell to the customer. It just defines the customer. But then we have the actual business events and the business processes that are happening down here, and that's where you start picking up the BI side. So just by looking at all these different interdependencies, you find that your BI elements lower down on the chain are dependent on lots of other things being in place before they can get going. I'm not sure if I answered that question, Stephanie. Is that a Does everyone understand what I'm trying to suggest here in terms of the master data? Of course, it's not just BI, right? It's also going to be a business application that produces and creates the data. But what I like about this is it gives me a quick understanding of where my BI is going to be, what marts need to be in place, where my master data is going to be, and things like that. Okay. Any other questions? Stefan, sorry, my apologies. How do you pronounce it?
Just as you said.
Stefan, okay. Sorry about that.
No problem.
Did it answer your question?
Yep, I think so.
Great. Okay.
Howard, I have a question about the understanding the data value chain.
Okay.
Do you have an example?
Yeah, so if we look at the data value chain, and let's say for example, we were to part of the business value chain was in terms of designing a product, then selling the product that meets the customer requirements, and then the billing of the requirements. So here what we start seeing here is the value chain is, so we start from a product, and that's fine, but then the next step in the product is creating a bill of materials. The bill of materials would then be sold. That would be sales data. And then we get into the orders, and then we get into customer invoice. So here we see that the data that starts off almost at a product level and grows to the invoice that includes the product, the bill of materials, includes the orders. And so we get the value chain as data. Product on its own, the value of that data is one thing, but when it comes down to an invoice level, that we have the customer invoice that's dependent on these other, that's when the data is becoming more and more valuable.
I see.
So you can see how we're getting more and more value out of the data as we progress. Product data on its own is not that valuable compared to the situation when it's being used as part of production order management or customer invoicing management. You notice how the value of that data has got better and better.
Yes.
Higher and higher. So my customer invoice management data is certainly more valuable than what my product management data is all about. But we have to be careful, for example, that we don't go, and that's what data quality should be doing, is if you have a good data quality strategy, you should be measuring the quality of the data as it progresses along the value chain, because what we're trying to achieve is high value assets. Okay, and we're trying to get more and more value out of our assets. So we should be doing data quality checks on the data as it moves along the value chain, and that we don't have something that's destroying the value of the product data as it moves, as it gets enhanced and improved. So you'd want to be able to look at how your products are performing at a customer invoice level. So how much money are we making out of this BOM? And a BOM is a collection. So Debbie, if you think of the chef recipe where you have a cake and it's made up of the individual details, you then have to say, well, am I paying too much for the yeast, or am I paying, so what is the value that the yeast brings to the cake at the end of the day and to sales? So you're seeing how the data is progressing and getting more and more valuable.
Yes, thank you so much. I understand.
Okay. Any other questions from anybody else? Great, guys. Thank you very much. Thanks everyone for attending.
Thank you, Howard, for all your hard work that goes into these sessions. If you want to receive the recording, we will be posting it on LinkedIn. So please make sure that you are connected with Howard Diesel on LinkedIn, and just keep an eye out for the recap. Thank you everyone for attending, and we'll see you next week for some more data architecture discussions.
Thanks, Howard.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everyone.
Bye.
Thanks everybody.
Bye.
So well, guys.
Thanks for joining.
Thanks.
Awesome.
Thank you,
Thanks a
everybody.
lot.